Hello and welcome to the Shea Anything podcast. Our host, Doug Williams, is on vacation. He's on a private island with the Kardashian and Jenner families up through, I believe, the rest of the week. So we are very pleased to be joined by our friend Todd Zeile. Hello, Todd.
Hi there, Andy. I'm going to be joining Doug this afternoon, so I appreciate you getting this out of the way early. That's nice of you.
You pushed back the wheels up time on the private jet, so we do appreciate that. We needed somebody to talk with me. Reminder to subscribe to Shea Anything here at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and also watch Mets Hot Stove Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. And if you like the iconic franchise in town, we talk about the Yankees on Baseball Night in New York every weeknight at 6. Sandy Alderson has said that he wants to turn the Mets into an iconic franchise like the Yankees. But he's not there yet. Todd, the Twitter icon that everybody wants to talk about, and the first step that Mets fans seem to want Sandy to take in this iconic direction is Trevor Bauer. It's a very online free agency so far. It's not something that we've quite seen the likes of yet. Apparently, I had to be directed toward this because I try not to spend 16 minutes watching anybody talk about anything on Twitter. But apparently he posted a 16-minute video, which included these lavish compliments about Steve Cohen. Again, unique for a free agency, a player talking online about an owner whose team he doesn't play for, at least yet. Todd, what do you make of this online free agency that Bauer is launching? Do you make anything of it? Do you think it's all just noise? Do you think it'll impact what happens?
I think it's more than I do think it's more than noise. I do think that it's unique. I think it's kind of a sign of the times that we live in. And, Trevor has started to sort of gain momentum as, what we would call a relevant Twitter personality over the last 18 months, especially. And during the time when there was, questions about how many games they might play or if there was going to be a COVID season at all. That's when I really started noticing, some of the things that he would say. I think he sort of toes the line of controversy without really jumping in, and he's obviously smart about how he conducts himself. But it has made it interesting to watch. Especially, I got a kick out. I just laughed during the playoffs and World Series when. Anytime somebody would struggle with a pitcher, he let that organization know that they might be better if they had a good starting pitcher. And now that he's the Cy Young Award winner, look, he's not just blowing smoke. He's got substance to go with his game now, his Twitter game. And so I think people are paying attention. I think organizations are actually paying attention because I think there is going to be a fight for him in some way, shape, or form. So the little bit of attention that he's giving each organization, I think, makes them feel like they may be in the hunt.
Our listeners may not realize or remember that you guys are both products of UCLA. And in terms of whether that gives us
we're also both products of the same high school too. We grew up in the same area in Valencia. He went to Hart High School in Newhall, as I did. And I think during the World Series, they showed a list of guys who have come out of there, and there's some pretty good ones, including, one of his teammates, Trevor, was Glasnow from the Rays. So, we are sort of from the same areas, but not necessarily cut out of the same cloth, as you can imagine.
No. When you were the few times that you were on the open market, you were not exactly advertising yourself on whatever version of this would have been in existence in the late 90s and early 2000s. That was not your style. You were always a more modest persona, but clearly you're open-minded to what Trevor's doing here. I'm interested in asking you if there's anything that we can learn about him in this sense of where his roots. I was thinking college, but you reminded me that you're also share even deeper roots in that. But people in the game know that there's a particular Stanford athlete, for example. They don't all fit into this mode, but a couple examples are Brody Van Wagenen, Ruben Amaro Jr., AJ Hinch, guys who are confident in themselves, usually intelligent, maybe strut around a little bit, very, very aware of their own intellect and abilities. Is there a UCLA type? And is Bauer either part of it or just such a creature unto himself that he's not part of whatever that might be?
That's funny because, I don't know if this is because we know each other so well that you're, poking me a little bit about Stanford, but that's, I hate Stanford. Sorry.
Look, I wasn't trying to make you go there.
No, I know
it's just funny though, because what they're all about.
But I totally agree. I think there is a type of Stanford athlete, and not necessarily all around athlete, but I think baseball player. Mark Marquis built the team around college fundamentals, getting guys over, hitting behind runners, scratching in, the run to win baseball games in college. It was a different mindset than, say, Arizona State, USC, and UCLA. And I think the one thing that I can say about the way UCLA developed players is you gave the player an opportunity to develop his own skills to make him better prepared, I think, for pro ball than maybe some guys from Stanford or so on that were really about the college game and what we used to call the Joe College game. So, look, I actually really, I think, admire Stanford as a university. I wanted to go there, and I got, kind of ousted at the last minute for somebody else out of Florida, ended up going to UCLA, and then kind of had that chip on my shoulder. But, when you look at UCLA as a whole, only one national championship. That was after my tenure. That was under John Savage, who's there now. My nephew was a part of that team. But in all their years of great baseball and a great university to be able to recruit good guys, only one national championship, but the most big leaguers in that same 30-year span have produced the most big league players. So they do let players develop into their own personality. I saw Trevor pitch when I was there, and Savage runs a pretty tight ship, a little different than Gary Adams when I was at UCLA, but he still had his own personality. He was definitely a quirky guy. He was like Turk Wendell with an A++ arm is the way I would describe Trevor when I saw him from early on coming out of high school and all the way up to what you see now as an accomplished big leaguer.
See, that's actually interesting. That's the sort of insight I was probably hoping to glean from this question and why I risked poking at your deep-seated Stanford feelings. It was worth it because we look at these two prominent UCLA guys in the game now, and where this helps us get some insight into Bauer is that Bauer and Garrett Cole, obviously two very different people and two guys who, by their own admission, didn't even get along in school, but two individuals, two guys who form their own plans. There's nobody more exacting about how he pitches than Cole. And if there is somebody, I guess it would be Bauer. So those are two guys, to your point, Todd, not whether they were part of a championship program or not, they certainly seem to have been encouraged to be individuals. So that's an interesting insight. I want to use our time that we have here with you to ask you and to dig in on some player evaluation stuff now with current Mets, because that's something that isn't in the expertise that Doug and I bring to the table, obviously, and you bring it to us on pre and post every week. First, kind of big picture before we get into some individual position stuff. If you're Sandy Alderson, if you're the president of or if you're hiring the president of baseball ops, or if you are the president of baseball ops, or you're running the Mets, and you look at the broad spectrum of the free agents and trade options that are available, and knowing what you know, Todd, about what the Mets need from watching every day, what do you do? What's your first move? What's your priority this offseason? I'll leave that very open.
I think as we watched things unfold last year, there was, at the beginning of this very unusual COVID-ridden short season, there was some hope and thought that you had at least a solid starting pitching staff and with a little bit of depth and a core offense, even though there wasn't great defense behind it. There was guys that could play a lot of positions and could find ways to score runs. What you saw evolve was the depth in the starting pitching staff went to nil, and especially with Noah and then Stroman opting out, and the things that we all saw unfold that we don't have to go over again, but Joaquin Porcello not being up to their billing. So I watched this evolve, and the bullpen was the big question mark. Was Lugo going to be as good as he was the year before? Was Diaz going to have a bounce back year? Could you get anything out of Betances? Justin Wilson, always solid. All the things that we knew were going to have to be fixed from the question mark standpoint to be able to have success. So what did we see? What we saw is a complete lack of depth in the starting pitching staff. We had a bullpen that actually was good for most of the season, and I think shows promise to be good again, and a core that still has, I think, the same sort of potential, although you saw some struggles from Alonso that you have to wonder, okay, which is the real Pete? And do you have to make sure that you keep Dominic Smith right there at the ready? I mean, he had such a breakthrough year. So obviously recapping a lot of things that happened. So to me, the number one priority, because I don't think you win, even with all the other elements, without good starting pitching. I think you've got to attack the pitching. I think he did a good job by getting Stroman. I thought Stroman was going to be out personally. When he accepted that qualifying offer, gave me a little confidence that he does really want to be a Met. He didn't make any bones about it. He was happy that Cohen took over, and he's going to be in that starting rotation. That's a big plus. I think you go after Trevor hard. I think you do go after Bauer hard and try to get that number two, that then you've got a 1-2-3 combination that's going to be as good as any in baseball with Jake at the top. And then I think you can piece some of the other pieces together, and they become less critical if you've got that great other starting pitcher.
So you mentioned Alonso and Smith, and I don't want to sort of boil it down to one of these either ors, like who you got, who's the first baseman. Obviously, both of these guys have a lot to recommend them as any team's first baseman of the future. But to dig down beyond just that opinion point of which one you keep, which one do you trade, how would you deal, if you're in a position of decision-making with that team, how would you deal with the fact that you've got these two guys who really are just both first basemen, and they're with your organization. You don't want to part easily with either of them. We saw Pete take off in a different direction this past year than what we expected. How do you resolve this situation? What do you do going into next year if you're running the team with those two guys?
Good question. And I don't know that you completely resolve it. I think that Dominic Smith did enough this year, and more than enough, to say, hey, this guy is not just a valuable trade chip anymore, yeah, which I think is what he was looking at, because you don't want a guy like that on the bench for 80 games of the season and coming off the bench to be a pinch hitter. You want this guy to play every day. I think he did a really good job of getting himself better in left field. He's never going to be a plus left fielder, but I think he's certainly an adequate left fielder, especially for what you get out of his bat. And, depending on, if Pete starts to come out of, sort of the funks that he had and is more like he was at the end of the season, putting together some quality at bats. He's not Dave Kingman, but he is not the same guy that he was for most of the 2019 season. Then I think you've got to have both of those guys, because I think they're such solid pieces on the right and left side of the batter's box in that lineup, and they're run producers as well. So I don't think you look to make either one of those guys go away. I think you try to find a way to keep them both in the lineup, and that would be, with Pete at first and Dom in left, unless there's, DH possibilities as well. But I think those are both guys that you keep on this team. I think there's some other guys that are potentially trade chips and affordable guys that you could make a move with. I don't think either of those two guys are the guys.
Here's where I get stuck a little bit. If you have both Smith and Alonso on the same team, and we all know that Smith is the superior first baseman, can a manager justify playing Alonso at first in any given day, given that you have a better infield with Smith out there, but then you have other factors of Alonso's DH numbers weren't great. He doesn't have the ability to play left, as you said, as Dom does. So is there a bigger picture where it does make sense to keep Alonso at first, or do you just play your better first baseman there?
Well, I think the interesting part about that whole conversation is because Pete came in to 2019 expected to be a slugger with no defensive abilities. And we were all, I would say, pleasantly surprised, if not shocked, by his ability at first base and his ability to work hard and get better and do good things around the bag, especially picking balls out of the dirt. He made some mistakes being too aggressive. But having said that, it's not like putting Piazza at first. Like when there was that question mark, hey, give Mike some days off and throw him at first. Mike just was never comfortable at first base. Pete is not that. Pete's a decent first baseman, and I think could be a better than decent first baseman. It just so happens that you're comparing him to Dom Smith, who is a Gold Glove caliber first baseman. So I don't think you lose a ton by keeping Pete at first and using Dom in left field. You could argue that you've weakened yourself at two positions. But if you want to be able to use Cano, let's say, to DH at times, even though he says he doesn't like it, his numbers were good DHing. You get the opportunity to have Jimenez, or you go make a move for a guy like Lindor, and you have a spot because you can utilize that DH with somebody like Cano. So I think the best flexibility for this team and the best opportunity for them to maybe get better in some of the up the middle defensive positions is to have Alonso at first, Dom and right, and reserve that DH for somebody like Cano potentially, and then spell the guys at DH once in a while, but don't designate them at this point.
You mentioned Alonso's like primary weakness at first in 2019 was that idea of being too aggressive, which is almost an error of enthusiasm, obviously, rather than skill. Picking up that ball at the second baseman should go for that kind of thing. Easily correctable. Based on your insight, Todd, I had been saying, well, that's basically Alonso's problem at first, is over enthusiasm. Did he regress in 2020 defensively in ways that now you'd say, yeah, he does that, but he also did this, that, or the other thing? Are there particular defensive points that he needs to improve on now out of 2020?
I think he can always make improvement. I think the problem that might have plagued him this year is what we saw offensively and defensively. And you can oversimplify it at some level, but I think it goes like this. He had such a good 2019. He was enthusiastic about getting back to the plate. He thought he was going to be the same guy at home plate and be the 50 home run guy, even though it was a shortened season, whatever that ratio was. But he also felt confident in his defensive ability, and he came in saying, hey, I'm the alchemist. I'm going to turn this leather into gold. And that's one of those type of Pete-isms that ended up sticking on him, because I think the offense ended up affecting him defensively. And you don't see that all the time, but it's easy to do as a guy that, especially a guy like Pete, that I think cares so much. He's not a guy that shrugs things off easily. He's a guy that you see him shaking his head and looking dejected when he strikes out with the bases loaded, or strikes out with one man on, or just struggles at the plate. And he takes that out into the field a little bit with him. And I thought I saw at least some of the mistakes he made last year were that trying to make up for not being as good at home plate, trying to make the spectacular play and be fancy and throw from his knees and do the things that create errors at times with that over aggressiveness, instead of being the guy that says, I'm going to make every play that's hit to me. I'm going to use my range the best of my ability. I'm going to pick the ball and keep the ball in front of me. And I don't have to make the spectacular play. If I do once in a while, it's great, but don't make mistakes by trying to be spectacular. Just be solid, because that's what he did the year before, because he had no expectations on it.
Right. And again, that sounds like more errors of approach or mentality than skill, which suggests that he could get right back to being a decent first baseman if he were to straighten out his entire game. You mentioned other young players who could be trade possibilities. I'm not calling for you to call for anyone to be traded today, but I was going to ask you about J.D. Davis anyway, in terms of came on the scene in 2019, impressed people. We didn't even know he was going to make the team. He ends up having this great year, came down to earth a little bit in 2020. Where do you see him settling in as a player? And do you think that his defense, which still was up and down at third and certainly in left last year, is that defense ultimately going to be problematic enough to mitigate the offense?
Well, I thought that he really showed a lot of improvement and potential and whatever you want to call it at third base last year. I think that surprised everybody because I think he was going to be thrown in there on occasion. And every time he did, he seemed to make a great play. He was solid. Is the thing that really kind of plagued him in the past was not so much putting the leather on the ball. It was catching. It was then completing the second half of the play, which I think is so mental. I saw him when he wanted to take the extra step, and then he'd rush the throw a little bit and then miss with that great arm of his. I know that he worked a ton with Desar in hits the leather, one step and release, step and release, step and release. And I know that it was something that he really worked hard on, and you could see a huge improvement there. So I think he's done himself a service by improving that side of his game, because his defense, as you said, I mean, his offense waned a little bit last year from the great 2019 season, but I think that anybody that watched him, and I'm thinking of this from two perspectives, from the Mets perspective and as a trade possibility, because look, there's a glut of those guys that play a couple of positions that aren't necessarily gold glovers in any one position. And you may, I think, see Sandy Alderson try to make some moves to get that strength up the middle. I mentioned Lindor. You could see a Springer move in the future as well to get that, bona fide center fielder. And all of those possibilities, I think, include a guy like J.D. Davis, because he still has team control. He's shown some really great potential offensively. And I think he had enough improvement defensively last year that teams think, hey, we can put him at third base and not hurt ourselves and maybe have a diamond in the rough here.
How much did the lack of defense up the middle hurt the team over this past year? And how desperate is that to improve? And there are teams, obviously, that succeed without really having that totally tightened up. Do the Mets need to address that this winter? From catcher all the way through to the middle of the
I think the thing that highlighted that was when they would put that Guillorme and have, Marisnik in center and Guillorme and Jimenez in the middle, and maybe even Nito or somebody behind the plate, where they had the strongest defense that they could put out there up the middle. And you had guys like Porcello seeing miraculous plays behind him, getting his confidence up, pitching to contact, getting deeper in games. And I think that is a product of having that strong defense up the middle. I think it's more than just, hey, we're going to see some guys make some, terrific plays. It's also a confidence boost for that pitching staff to not think they have to be perfect or don't think they have to strike guys out. Start pitching to contact, and you get a little more depth. That takes relief off the bullpen. There's this chain of events that happens when you're strong up the middle. And that's where I think they may really look to try to make improvements. It's not just because you could say one individual was bad or needs, huge improvement. It's that the collective, I think, creates more benefits than just, some good defenders out on the field.
And, you mentioned Lindor, but sort of taking that big possibility out for a second, if you're choosing between Jimenez and Rosario as your shortstop continually next year, did Jimenez do enough for you at the plate? He surprised us by being good, but did you see signs of sustainability? Did you see him make adjustments to it, the counter adjustments to adjustments that were made to him? Do we still need to see that? Is 60 games? How much did that tell you about what he might be if he's an everyday player?
I think there was, I guess you would say, so much more offense than was expected that it then gave us that were analyzing him on a day-to-day basis, I think, propensity to cut him more slack than was probably necessary as he started to struggle. I think he struggles on the changeup, especially. I think it's something that the league's going to pick up on. He was really good on the fastball, better on the fastball than I thought he would be. He showed power to the opposite field, which was something that was a bit of a surprise, I think, to most of us watching him. But he's so good defensively that some of the weaknesses that may get exploited on the offensive side, you can probably live with and let him grow into and show some growing pains and let him evolve. But I do think that there's still going to be a battle. Let's just take Lindor out of the picture, like you said, and say that Rosario and Jimenez both come to spring training, shooting for that shortstop position. I think you're going to see a likelihood that that Rosario takes some fly balls in the outfield and see if there's an opportunity to maybe move him to center field at some point. I think you're going to see both those guys taking some balls at second base as well. And to the point of Cano being DH, you let Jimenez play second base. Jimenez is really good at third base, which could be an option if there's a JD Davis move. So I think they're leaving the field, pun intended, wide open right now. And I don't think they want to commit to who's their shortstop and who's their solid guy. I think they want these guys to come in and show that they're ready to go and let them battle it out for the playing time that they are both vying for.
If you're a young player and you come up and struggle, particularly against the changeup, as you said Jimenez did, is that a hole that can be sort of patched up through work, or is that something, if you have that hole when you come up in your swing, does that tend to be something that you're going to struggle with?
Well, it's a good question. I think it's something that he'll have, a propensity to struggle with, more than some other things. But I did see him make adjustments on things. And when I say make adjustments, it wasn't that he took the same approach and then all of a sudden learned how to hit the changeup. It's that I could see him pick a pitch in a certain situation, and which is something that young hitters have a difficulty doing. What I mean by that is when he knows he's been beat on the changeup for one at bat or a second at bat, and he comes up with a man on in his third at bat, he may sit on the changeup and let the fastball go and put a good at bat together. Whether he gets the hit or not, you can see him thinking through the at bats and trying to make adjustments rather than just walking up there and free swinging. And so I think what a lot of us noticed watching him every day is that he's a very heady player. He's got a very high baseball IQ. You can see that defensively. He's backing up the right bases. He's always in the play. He's telling other guys where to throw the baseball. Mm-hmm. He's always in the position, much like Jeter was when he played shortstop in New York. Jeter always found himself to be in that position to make the great play or to back up the right guy. Jimenez has that same kind of baseball IQ, and so it doesn't surprise me to see him making those kind of adjustments at the plate as well.
Before we let you go, I want to ask you about Diaz too, in the sense that, okay, so we know that the overall numbers in the year were good. We watched the games where he was de-emphasized into lower leverage situations and built himself back up. So where he ended up, let's just say there's a world where you're on the top step of that dugout and you have to use your gut as well as those terrific numbers to make the call. And you say, okay, 9th inning, 1 run, New York City, 2021 season. Can you pull the trigger yet on calling for Edwin Diaz, or is he still a guy who you think probably would thrive just more in the 6th, 7th, 8th inning than in the 9th, or is he past that?
No, I think he's our closer. I think if I'm, as you said on the top step there, I think he's my closer, and I think there's 2 reasons for that. I don't think 19 and 20 were, so different because of a luck factor or because of lower leverage situations. I think Hefner had a big influence on him, both mentally and physically. I saw some adjustments made mechanically, and the adjustments for him are between here and here on his slider. It's a half an inch difference on his delivery that gets bite on the slider going down or drifting across. And last year, 2019 especially, there was a lot of guys that struggled with their slider. We had a lot of reports of that anyway, but his was flat and stayed on the same plane. So if he's throwing everything hard for a hitter, if it stays on the same plane, you've got a chance against him with that slider. If you're getting the slider to fall off the table and get that downward movement with that high rise on the fastball, now he's a completely different pitcher, in my opinion, which is why he was striking out on average 2 guys an inning. And my confidence in him would be, hey, this is our closer. Go out and make sure that Hefner keeps that eye on those mechanics, because I think he was the guy that was sort of the Diaz whisperer last year that kept his mechanics on par and kept him consistent with only a bad outing or 2 through the course of that 60-game season.
Did Diaz began the season on opening day? I know he blew that save the first weekend or whatever it was, but did he have that adjustment down with the slider release point at the beginning of the season, or did he work on that through when he was taken out of the closer role for a bit? And then
no, I think it got better when he was taken out of the closer role, because I think they really emphasized it, but I think he had it. I think we noticed it in his very, very first outing of the year. He does well. He looks good. And then there was the next outing with the Segura home run where he went back to the same pitch, which was actually the fastball away. And I thought that was bad pitch selection. I thought that was bad execution. Right. Even though he beat him with that same 98 mile an hour fastball the day before, Segura is one of those kind of hitters. So, kick that aside. I thought his mechanics had improved from the time the season started. And I think Hefner did a great job when he would get a little bit out of sync, which he can do. He's arms and legs and flying, and he's got a lot of things that are not like mechanically perfect, like somebody like DeGrom. And so you get those times where they slip out of perfect sync. I think Hefner does a really good job of making sure that he stays in sync.
Todd, thank you for all the insight. It's fascinating. I get caught up in all this. Who are they going to sign? Who are they going to trade for? And I forget that we got into this to talk about the actual baseball game. So it's a breath of fresh air in the hot stove season to have you here.
I appreciate it, Andy. Anytime, as you well know.
So thanks for listening, and a reminder to subscribe to Shea Anything at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be back in my natural role as your reporter, analyst, and a more capable host will be in charge again when Doug returns from the private island. Thanks for listening, everybody.